Hi there, welcome to this MCQ revision blast for psychopathology. How this is going to work, there's going to be 15 questions that I'm going to talk through. When I've read through the question, just pause the video, give yourself plenty of time to think about your answer and keep a record of your score as you go along. We'll start with question 1. Question 1. Which of these describes the statistical infrequency definition of abnormality? Is it A, unwritten rules about what is acceptable in society, B, inability to cope with the demands of everyday life, C, behaviours that are not seen very often in society, D, the absence of desirable traits? Pause the video. The correct answer that I'm looking for there is C. So A there is deviation from social norms, B is failure to function adequately, and D is deviation from ideal mental health. So we've picked out statistical infrequency as the definition of focus because it's often one that students tend to struggle with the definition of. So in addition to what we have there for C, what else could we say about it? Well, we could make reference to the normal distribution curve, which is seen there on your slide. You might remember this from research methods. And this is one way in respect to how we might define behaviours that are not seen very often. So if we take the example that's on this slide here on the normal distribution of IQ, and if we look on the curve there, you can see in the middle that top point, and that's where the mean, median and mode are going to be. This is where we've got most people in the general population. There we have an average of IQ for 100. And if you move out towards the edges of the curve, that's to say on either side of the curve, you'll see the percentage of the population is going to fall in respect to who has those levels of IQ. That's to, like I say, very low or very high. So in effect, what this definition argues, of course, is that having a high IQ is just as abnormal as having a low IQ. Question 2. Which of these is not one of Jehoda's characteristics of ideal mental health? Is it A, positive view of yourself, B, resisting stress, C, environmental mastery, D, conforming to societal rules? So pause the video. Okay, so D there is actually a definition of deviation from social norms. Now, like we said with the last question where we looked at extending the definition of statistical infrequency, we're basically doing the same here. So with deviation from ideal mental health, there's numerous points we could discuss, basically based around Jehoda's criteria. And what you might notice here about all of the criteria is that they paint a picture of not what it looks like to be mentally unhealthy, but instead mentally healthy. So Jehoda's checklist almost works, Jehoda's criteria almost works like a checklist towards gaining mental health. All right, 3. Which characteristic of depression is being described here? Since losing her job, Laura is unable to focus on anything. It's become so bad she is struggling to find another job and she can't even fill out job applications. Is it A, behavioural, B, emotional, C, cognitive, or D, mental? Pause the video. The correct answer there is C. So in respect to the characteristics, you have to be able to refer to behavioural, emotional and cognitive characteristics of depression, OCD and phobias. D on that slide there is a bit of a red herring, and hopefully you'd spot with Laura that that was an example of a cognitive characteristic, as there's a distinct lack of concentration there on her part. 4. Which of these is a behavioural characteristic of OCD? Is it A, compulsions, B, intrusive thoughts, C, anxiety and depression, or D, selective attention? Pause the video. Right, the correct answer here is A. Now, people often misunderstand OCD and they assume that it's only about the compulsion side of the disorder without realising the reason why people feel compelled to carry out these compulsions. And the reason, of course, that they do it is because of the cognitive characteristic listed here as B, which is intrusive thoughts. So that's to say that the intrusive thought is very uncomfortable for the individual, which produces the emotional characteristic listed there as C of anxiety. And people, of course, want to get rid of that feeling, and they feel some relief by carrying out the compulsive behaviour. So, for example, the intrusive thought of the germs are going to kill me creates anxiety, so the individual constantly washes their hands in order to relieve the anxiety that produce this thought. So it's kind of like the OCD cycle, if you like. Question 5. According to the two-process model, how are phobias maintained? A. Rationalising negative thoughts about phobic stimulus. B. Through avoidance. C. Associating the phobic stimulus with fear/anxiety. Pause the video. The correct answer here is B. So this is basically the two-process model, and the two-process model, of course, is the behavioural explanation of phobias, and it states that phobias are initiated through a process of classical conditioning, which is C there, where you learn to associate a stimulus with a fear. And then that phobia is then maintained through a process of operant conditioning, which is basically negative reinforcement, the idea being that the avoidance of the phobic stimulus leads to a reduction in feelings of anxiety. Question 6. Which of these evaluations about systematic desensitization is incorrect? Is it A, there is research evidence to support its effectiveness? B, it's not effective for treating all phobias. C, it's less ethical than flooding. Or D, it may not always treat the root cause as other phobias may later occur. Pause the video. Right, the correct answer there is C, well, because it's actually more ethical. The issue with flooding, of course, is that it's often difficult for participants to actually give consent, as it's hard for them to really truly understand what they may experience during the flooding experience. Now for A here, there is lots of evidence to support the effectiveness of systematic desensitization. B here refers to the fact that some phobias, well, of course, may not have been learnt, and if they weren't learned, perhaps they've come about, for example, through a process of maybe being evolved, thinking about Seligman's biological preparedness. In this case, a behavioural therapy isn't going to be effective for this disorder. Another issue with the effectiveness is listed there with D, which is basically a psychodynamic argument that argues that the root cause of the phobia won't be addressed through systematic desensitization, so the symptoms of a phobia may appear in another guise. This is something that we refer to as symptom substitution. Question 7. Which behavioural characteristics of phobias does flooding help prevent? Is it A, unreasonable fear and anxiety, B, irrational thinking about the object/situation, C, disturbed sleep pattern, or D, avoidance behaviour? Pause the video. Right, the correct answer here is D. So let's just clarify what the other answers there are. Now A is an emotional characteristic of phobias. B is the cognitive characteristic of phobias. And although C is a behavioural characteristic, it's actually a behavioural characteristic of depression and not phobias. Remember, the whole premise of flooding is based on the behavioural assumption that in order to maintain the phobia, you have to keep avoiding the thing you're scared of. So if we stop the individual performing this avoidance behaviour, the phobia can no longer be maintained. 8. Put these in order, lowest to highest, for the order they would appear on a fear hierarchy for someone who had a phobia of spiders. So you're just going to report the 4 letters in order. Pause the video. Okay, so the correct answer I'm looking for is D, looking at a picture of a cartoon spider. C, looking at a picture of a real spider. A, seeing a friend touch a spider. And B, touching the spider. Okay, now this is all about systematic desensitization. And remember, systematic desensitization is very much a process. And part of this process is the construction of the fear hierarchy with the patient. And remember that these hierarchies start small, and you can't have any progression until the next stage, until the individual can face that stage and be totally relaxed. The top of the fear hierarchy is always going to be facing that phobic stimulus. And just remember, on the specification alongside systematic desensitization, it does make explicit reference to hierarchies and relaxation as part of systematic desensitization. All right, question 9. According to Beck, what is it that maintains the negative triad? Is it A, negative self-schemas, B, negative triad, C, negative effect, or D, negative gain? Pause the video. Right, the correct answer here is A. So what Beck said, in order to maintain this triad, that's to say the negative view of the self, the future and the world, we need to have what he called a negative self schema. These are basically negative perceptions of ourselves, and we have them basically through a learned experience in childhood. We get them, for example, through interactions maybe with our parents, our teachers. Sorry about that. An example of a negative self schema is what we call the ineptness schema. And this makes people who have it basically expect to fail. So the ineptness schema can result, therefore, in a negative perception of the future or negative views about what's going to happen in the future because, of course, you expect to fail. Question 10. Which two of these are examples of cognitive biases? A. Displacement, B. Catastrophizing, C. Overgeneralization, or D. Attention. Pause your video. Right, the correct answer there is B and C. So cognitive biases are also part of Beck's cognitive explanation, and a cognitive bias is basically a tendency to focus on the negative aspects of the situation rather than the positives. The problem is that when we do this, we distort situations. So here we've got two examples of cognitive bias. We've got the overgeneralization, and this is the tendency to make really sweeping conclusions. For example, if you fail one psychology test, it means you're going to fail them all. Catastrophizing is another cognitive bias, and it's where small setbacks are viewed as really, really major disasters. So for example, you fail one psychology test, I'm never going to get into uni, oh God, I'm never going to get a job, and ultimately I'm going to end up sad and alone. Question 11. Which method of disputing is illustrated in this question a therapist may pose to a client? Can you give me proof that this is accurate? Is that A, pragmatic, B, logical, C, consequential, D, empirical? Pause the video. Okay, that's empirical. C there is a red herring, consequential. Like I said, the question there on your screen is an example of the empirical method of disputing, which basically asks the individual to back up their irrational beliefs with evidence in the hope that the lack of evidence they can provide may in some way change that belief. Remember, disputing is a method aimed at challenging the irrational beliefs that depressed people hold in order to bring forward a more rational way of thinking and, as a result, healthier emotional consequences. Question 12. A friend passes you in the street and fails to say hello. You tell yourself that you must have done something wrong and, as a result, delete your friend from Facebook. What is the underlined text an example of? So that bit that's underlined there, what is it? Is it A, a consequence, B, a belief, C, a rational belief, or D, an irrational belief? Pause the video. All right, the correct answer there is D. That's an irrational belief. The chances are that maybe just your friend didn't see you. And this is, of course, at the core of Ellis's ABC model in respect to how our thinking, that is to say our beliefs about activating events, will ultimately determine how we feel, and that's a consequence. And obviously I've just popped a picture of the ABC model here because there's two sides to this model. You have an activating event and you could have an irrational belief about it which would result in negative consequences, or you could have a positive belief about it, much more rational, which would result in healthier emotional consequences. Question 13. Which two of these statements describe the effects that genes associated with OCD have? A. Results in higher levels of dopamine. B. Results in lower levels of dopamine. C. Results in lower levels of serotonin. D. Results in higher levels of serotonin. So which two of those are correct? Pause the video. Right, the answer here is A and C. Now this is basically making reference to the SERT and the COMP gene and how they function in OCD. Now you are required to have an understanding of the genetic explanation of OCD, and referring to specific genes is a really good way to demonstrate that understanding. So the COMP gene in OCD helps regulate the production of dopamine, and it seems that with OCD it malfunctions in some way, resulting in higher levels of dopamine. The SERT gene is involved in the regulation of serotonin, and in OCD there's some malfunction that seems to cause lower levels of this neurotransmitter, and this is because the SERT gene increases the activity of the reuptake mechanism, resulting in less serotonin being left in the synapse. Question 14. Which two of these brain regions have been said to be associated with OCD? A. The adrenal gland. B. Orbital frontal cortex. C. Caudate nucleus. D. Occipital cortex. So I want two. Right, the correct answers that I'm looking for are B and C. Now, these two are part of the brain that make up what's been termed the worry circuit. So in a normally functioning individual, you get a potential worry from your environment, and the orbital frontal cortex receives that worry and sends it to the thalamus by something called the caudate nucleus. Now the caudate nucleus basically acts like a braking system. So in normal, healthy, functioning individuals, it's able to suppress those worries. In OCD, however, the caudate nucleus basically doesn't do its job. That's to say, it doesn't put the brakes on it. So the worry travels to the thalamus. The thalamus says, oh my gosh, yes, worry, sends a message back, and then we get the impulse to perhaps carry out compulsive behaviours. So just like I said before, you're required to know genetic explanations, which would be the Compton SERT. You're also required to know a neural explanation. The worry circuit is a really good example of a neural explanation of OCD. All right, final question, and it is, what is this structure called? Is it A, postsynaptic neuron, B, receptor, C, reuptake mechanism, or D, neurotransmitter? Pause your video. Correct answer here is C. Now, the reuptake mechanism you may also have referred to as the transporter mechanism. And you'll remember in question 13 I spoke about the SERT gene increasing the activity of that reuptake mechanism. And this is why OCD is often treated with drugs that are called SSRIs. That's selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. The clue's all in the name there, really, isn't it? What these drugs do is they effectively block off this reuptake mechanism in order to increase the amount of serotonin being left in the synapse, and as such can alleviate some of the symptoms associated with OCD. All right, I hope you did good. If you're struggling on psychopathology, there's loads of revision notes on tutor2u.net. There is also another psychopathology revision blast that you can have a go at, and there's plenty of MCQ blasts for all of your other topics. Good luck.